So you think that you're not racist or you're trying to be an anti-racist, but how are you supposed to do it? And what does it mean when a white person says, I'm not racist? Well, let's get into it. So I think that the first thing to do is to step back a little bit and try to understand what it is that we mean when we say that somebody is racist or that something is racist. Omi and Winant, who wrote in 1993, they claim that the concept of race is never a stable one. Rather, it belongs to a process of formation and negotiation. They highlighted the role of state institutions and the policies that they carry out in conditioning social relationships. Furthermore, Rex attested that throughout colonialism, exploitation was made possible through legal inequality, which was justified by race. But it was after colonialism ended that racism came to play a more important role, because ideology as such is more important with the absence of any legitimate force. So I think that's an important concept to understand. Firstly, is that race is never stable. When I was doing my master's in sociology, I had a lot of Italian professors, and they always loved to remind me that back in the day, Italian people were considered to be people of color. They were not classified as white. And for example, if you had a North African man, like a Moroccan man in France, he would definitely not be classified as white. But if you put him in North America, he would be classified as white. And if you had a Hispanic man who was in North America, he would not be classified as white. And then you put him in Europe, in North Europe, he would be classified as white. So classifications of race change not only over time, but they also change depending on the location of the person and the socio-political economic situation of the country or the area in which that person, that individual is in. So that's important to understand, that the very concept of race is not stable. Of course, just to go backwards, race doesn't exist, right? There's no such thing as race. It's just a social concept that was created by white people in order to justify colonial expansion, in order to justify slavery, and of course, because racism is ultimately profitable for the white man. It doesn't exist. But as a social concept, it does exist, and so that's why we continue to use the concept of race. So then we get to the 1960s, which is why I wanted to discuss Carmichael and Hamilton. They coined the concept of institutional racism. It was in 1967, and it was to describe the system. It was to describe the type of systemic exclusion that was faced by African Americans, despite the legal equality that was achieved during the 1960s in the civil rights movement in the U.S.
The only type of power we could have is black power. So I just made a speech building up to it, building up, showing that it wasn't a question of morality, it wasn't a question of being good or bad, it was simply a question of power. And that we black people had no power, and we had to have some power. The only type of power we could have is black power.
Subsequently, scholars argued that the concept of institutional racism became a kind of catch-all phrase, which sort of stopped meaning anything because it failed to provide a theoretically adequate account of the creation and the perpetuation of racial inequality. There are also people that argue that racism, it isn't an individual act, rather it's a manifestation of structural features of societies, rather than it being the outcome of an action or a group, or an individual. Or other people decided that it meant laws, customs, practices, that kind of understanding of institutional racism, which then perpetuated inequalities. However, authors have also criticized such claims because it removes responsibilities from individual action. I would agree with that. I would say that if we just can kind of wipe our hands and say no, it's an institutional problem. What does that mean? Because an institution is made up of individuals, and institutional policies can only be acted out through individuals. And those individuals within that institution have massive discretional capabilities, which has been, very widely documented with research on bureaucracies. So if we take, the obvious example, if we take the example of a policeman who is confronted with a situation in which he has a man of color and he has a white man, he has a man of color who is working class, and he has a white man who is middle class, the way in which he's going to react are going to be based upon and drawn from stereotypes that are at once classed, raced, and gendered. And that will influence how he might respond in what could be the same situation, right? So that's an example of an individual within an institution who has discretional capability in how he responds, but that is, as I say, drawn from class, race, and gender, or draws on, sorry. But then we have like the kind of, I don't know, the current day racism, right? In current day racism, I feel like we have two different types of racism, like we have two different camps. We have like the proper racists, and then we have what are called the tacit racists. So authors called Rules and Duck in 2020, they argued that contemporary racism does not usually take an obvious form that we can see and prevent. Rather, it masquerades as the most ordinary of daily actions. So in order to understand this, they coined the concept of tacit racism, which describes the institutionalization of our everyday expectations. They argue that acting on this racism does not require conscious intent. Actions are racist if race with a capital R is coded into them. This is such an interesting and important book, I think, and it has really informed my understanding of racism, because I think that at once we have this kind of like micro-racialization, which is very much expressed at an individual level, and then we have like macro-racializing tendencies, but they aren't separate, like they act together, entwined with one another. And so when we talk about institutional racism, obviously we're also talking about like the macro picture in which we can see educational achievement outcomes drastically different between members of the so-called indigenous population and then members of the population who may have migrant origins. Because, for example, where I live right now, I live in Belgium, and in Belgium there's like a massive classification, a difference between those who are Belgian with Belgian parents and Belgian grandparents and those who have migrant heritage. And then if we switch that over and we go to the UK, that's really a faux pas. In the UK, we talk about minorities and we talk about majorities and we talk about people of colour and we talk about white people. So what is really important to understand is that like even when we say, like as a white person, I'll be like, no, I'm anti-racist. Like I'm not racist. I don't have racist thoughts. And maybe, you know, good for you, babe. You don't have racist thoughts. Like that's brilliant. Pat yourself on the back. But it's far more complicated than that. And that's how it can be like a little bit frustrating, because although we don't want to be, those of us who are what I would classify as tacit racists, not proper racists, don't want to be racist. We don't want to live in a world that's structured with this level of inequality that we have. Significantly, it's so important to understand that the level of inequality we have in the world is built upon the back of racism, and we would not have inequalities if we didn't have racism, not on the same kind of global scale. And of course you can come in and be like, oh, but gender was the first inequality. Men realized that they can profit off the labor of women, and men continue to profit off the labor of women, and we still see massive gendered differences, which is true. And then of course we have class. Again, the class system is profitable to the certain few, it's true. And then we also have race. But if we're looking at like the global macro picture, the way in which neoliberalism works on the global sphere, we have to have race, to have neoliberalism. We have to have race to have capitalism. And if you want to live in a post-racist world, you have to live in a post-neoliberal world, a post-capitalist world, because otherwise you will never end racism. The reason that racism exists is because it is profitable for white people. The reason that racism continues to exist is because it is profitable for white people. And so as a white person, you are profiting from a system that places you on top.
Been here in Africa, huh?
3 months. And before that, Afghanistan and Bosnia.
You come here with your laptop computer and your malaria medicine and your little bottles of hand sanitizer. Think you're going to change the outcome, huh? Let me tell you something. You sell blood diamonds too.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me, how is that?
Who do you think buys the stones that I bring out? Dreamy American girls who all want a storybook wedding and a big shiny rock. It's like the ones they see in the advertisements of your politically correct magazine. So please, don't come here and make judgments on me, all right?
Of course, it places us on top in different ways. If you are a cis hetero man, a cis hetero white middle class man, it's going to be a different treatment than if you're a trans man, if you're a trans woman, if you're homosexual, if you're a woman, if you're working class. Like obviously there are different elements that intersect. And I use that word consciously, in this hierarchy and in this creation of hierarchy. But that doesn't mean that you do not profit from a system, that we do not profit. I'm white. We profit from a system that places white people on top, and it continues to exist exactly because it's profitable. And so if you say like, oh babe, I'm not racist, I'm anti-racist, I would argue that it is impossible to be. I genuinely believe that in the society that we live in and the way in which the global economy is structured, it is impossible to be anti-racist. That's the micro picture, right? The macro, I apologize, that's the macro picture. But then in the micro picture, actually, I think that even just like within our own thoughts, I think it's very difficult to be not racist, in my opinion. And I think that, I invite you to cultivate an important self-reflection and a self-awareness about your own thoughts, because like the way that I understand it in my mind is that my thoughts are the books that sit upon the shelves. The shelves are racist. Like the very structure upon which my thoughts sit, is racialized. But my thoughts themselves, the books, they are not racist. I do not have racist thoughts about people, but that does not mean the very structure upon which my thoughts are placed is racist or racialized. And I think that it can be quite difficult to cultivate that inner awareness and that inner criticism to kind of catch yourself and catch your thoughts and catch your, the stereotypes that you rely on and catch your little prejudices. I think it's very difficult to be non-racist. So that doesn't mean that there aren't people in the world that aren't racist, because I do believe that that's true. But if we just take the example of like Northern Europe or of the so-called like Western countries, I think it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to actually not be racist. And I think that what's difficult is being aware of how your mind relies on racialized structures of knowledge, if you see what I mean. And I think that one of the things that we can do as white people is not claim like, but I'm not a racist. I think it's better to claim that I need to struggle towards something that is desirable, which is anti-racism, post-racism, within myself from like a micro perspective, to be more critically aware of myself. And then as well, I mean, that's great if you can make that, because that is already a massive hurdle. But then as well, we have to work simultaneously at the macro picture. And the macro picture is the one that is really, really, really difficult. And that's going to take like massive work and generations. But what's key is the first step in understanding that racism is profitable. And that's why it exists. And if you profit from it, like I saw this Irish comedian the other day being like, well, I'm supposed to have the white guilt, and I don't have the white guilt because we grew our own potatoes. Sorry, that's such a bad accent. And of course, in the example of the Irish, it is a bit different because Ireland was technically colonized by the English, right? And when we start thinking about potatoes, like there was a big potato famine in Ireland and people starved. But at the same time, the English was still exporting potatoes to England, right? People were starving in Ireland and business was still continuing. And the potatoes that were growing were still being taken out of Ireland to the English. So of course, the way in which that we can have colonial guilt is different depending on your heritage. But that does not mean that you do not profit from racialized systems of inequality. That's kind of key. And so when I talk about this, that kind of bigger picture, I think what's important to understand is that, like, I'm not drawing this from the air. What I massively recommend that you read is a book that's called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, by Cedric J. Robinson. This was so informative to me when I first read it. I was like, this is one of those epiphany moments. I read it during my master's in a class for racisme et antiracisme, and it was really an epiphany moment. The very first sentence of chapter 1 says, the historical development of world capitalism was influenced in a most fundamental way by the particularistic forces of racism and nationalism. Like, he actually goes back, he's a historian, and he goes back to the very formation of capitalism and the way in which capitalism was able to be brought into fruition in Western Europe. And racism was an essential part of that. Like, race was an essential part of that. And race still continues to be an essential part of it. Like, you think that you have labor rights, and the people that make your clothes, you know, the people of color who make your clothes in a country that you can't see, they don't have labor rights. You know, it is a racist system and we all do profit from it. So yeah, check yourself before you say that you're not racist, because it's completely possible, if not probable, that actually in an invert way we all are. And actually working towards anti-racism doesn't necessarily mean only fighting against the proper racist, although that's a conversation for another day. It also means fighting against the systems of tacit racism that we are all subjected to. So thank you very much for watching. I hope maybe you learned something new, or maybe it sparked your curiosity in one way or another. If you didn't agree with me, then it doesn't matter. What matters is just that we can have an open and critical debate and conversation about racism and about anti-racism, and also about the role of white people within that.
Sorry. Amazing grace. Oh, how sweet the sound, yeah. That saved a wretch like. Oh.